This morning's scripture comes from two different spots in the Bible. The first one, Matthew 5:4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." The second one comes from John 11:32 through 36, and it says, "When Mary arrived where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, 'Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died.' When Jesus saw her crying, and the Jews who had come with her crying also, he was deeply disturbed and troubled. He asked, 'Where have you laid him?' They replied, 'Lord, come and see.' Jesus began to cry. The Jews said, 'See how much he loved him.'" Respond with me, please. We thank you for the word of God.
Would you pray with me? Gracious God, we are thankful to you for your presence here with us and your presence here within us. And we ask now, oh God, that this word, this message that has been prepared would be of you and would be from you. And may our hearts and our ears and our lives be open and ready to receive whatever it is you have for us this day. And we ask it in your name. Amen. I remember growing up as a kid in the 80s and 90s, we talked a lot about pollution. Talked a lot about like Earth care, and Earth Day was a huge thing. I remember I had a sticker book that you could, like, as you did the things, you could put the little stickers in and like feel like an awesome Earth savior. And I know this is not a new concept to my generation. It's going around for a while, but I remember there were like these really specific ideas that we had. This idea of like toxic waste. You don't remember like when they went through that phase where it was the nuclear waste, and you had that like hazmat symbol and everything was green and glowing. We watched an episode of Scooby-Doo the other day, and they were down in the cave and they had the big vats of what looked like nuclear waste. It was legit glowing, had the symbol and everything on it. And I swear to you, the people went, just ripped the lid off and like climbed right in it. And I'm like, all right, guys, now that's called a nuclear waste symbol. If it's green and glowing, don't touch it. We've got this like, we talk about pollution in a lot of different ways. But I don't know that we talk as much about noise pollution or light pollution. Y'all familiar with light pollution? It's the excessive use of artificial light. We have light coming off of our buildings, off of our signs, from our sports events, even from the street lights that we have, that we encounter all the time. And it's interesting to me, in the United States and in Europe, 99% of the population does not have access to, cannot experience a natural night. I attended a retreat a couple years back in New Mexico, and we were out in the middle of nowhere, the type of place where you have very limited cell phone reception. And so there were very few lights outside, just enough to barely be able to navigate, but not enough that you might not break your ankle. And so at night, I remember standing out there looking up at the sky going, oh my gosh, I had no idea there were this many stars. Like, but until you see it and like take in the magnitude of that moment, you're kind of awash with wonder. We forget that that's out there. And so the result of all of this light pollution is we lose the natural rhythm of light and dark. And there's something really powerful about the darkness. Of course, we have that vulnerability. We don't know what's prowling out there. We can't see. There's a bit of a trust factor, I suppose, that goes on. But there's also a stillness that comes in the darkness. Because darkness tends to come at the end of the day, and after the rush of the activities are over and the light begins to dim, and we pause, and we have wonder and stillness before us. Most of us are not big fans of darkness. We prefer the light and the activity and the rush of doing things. We don't want to have to deal with our darkness. And yet, this morning's beatitude is, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. A show of hands, how many of us prefer to mourn? Grieve? Experience sadness? Pain? Heartache? No takers. None. But blessed are those who mourn feels paradoxical. It feels contrary, maybe even impossible. How do we find blessing in the midst of heartache? This morning, we are venturing into the book of John, and we are talking about the death and eventual resurrection of Lazarus. Now we learn that Lazarus is a close friend to Jesus. He is brother to Mary and to Martha, but might have been someone that Jesus stayed with often when he came and visited town. And Jesus learns of Lazarus' illness and eventually of his death. And he goes to visit Mary and Martha. And there, verse 21, Martha meets him on the way, and the thing that she says to him is, if you had been here, Lazarus wouldn't have died. Essentially, why didn't you save us from our grief? It's a common question for those who grieve. Why me? Why us? Why couldn't we be saved from this? Why do we have to suffer in this way? We ask all of these why questions. We want to make sense of what has happened. And it's almost as if we feel like if we can solve logically the questions in our heads, perhaps it will resolve the emotional hurt of our hearts. Jesus continues on to the village, and he meets up with Mary, and she has a similar statement to Jesus. If you had been here, we could have controlled what happened. We could have strong-armed death. We could have beat this thing. She is desperate to fix her pain. She has this idea in her head. If only we had done X, Y, and Z, life would be different. My loved one would still be here. I wouldn't have had to experience the pain and the grief of loss. We recognize those painful questions, don't we? We've asked those questions. And yet notice what happens next. As Jesus surveys the scene, as Jesus engages with what is going on in his situation and his surroundings, he's watching Mary and Martha and those gathered weeping. And he asks, where is Lazarus? Where is he laid? And then he himself, as they invite him to come see Lazarus, verse 35, Jesus weeps. Lots of church kids, as Jesse mentioned, love this verse because it's easy to memorize. Now, when I was growing up, when we memorized verses, we got candy bars for memorizing the verses. So this was a very popular one. Right? And kids, I'm telling you, next time you memorize verses, hit up Jesse for candy bars. No pressure. So, you kind of walk up. Jesus wept. John 11:35. Shortest verse in the Bible, and yet it packs a punch. It tells us about who God is and about how we have been created. At the heart of Islam, the core of Muhammad's teaching is this idea that there needs to be an immediate and an unquestioning acceptance that whatever life brings is the will of the wise God. This idea that we come at peace with what happens in life. But there's a story told. There was a man named Seed. It was Muhammad's oldest slave, and Seed died. And Seed's daughter came upon Muhammad, and she found him broken and weeping. And she's confused, she's bewildered. Muhammad, the one who is teaching this unquestioning acceptance of all the things that happen in life, who's supposed to be at peace with all of life, she says, what am I seeing here? Muhammad answers, you see a friend weeping over his friend. So too with Jesus. The experience of love and loss is intrinsically human. It's a part of how we've been created. Alan Wolfeld, a grief counselor, he says, the hurt we feel is the consequence of the love we were privileged to experience. In welcoming our grief, we bear witness to the mystery of the true and full nature of love and loss. And yet, we avoid the pain of grief at all costs. We apologize when we cry. Have you ever noticed this? I'm so sorry, I'm crying. We apologize when we say something that reminds someone else of something that causes them to cry. I'm so sorry I made you cry. We step away and we hide our faces when we're emotional. We try to settle ourselves down before we engage with other people. Anyone who's ever worked in an office, you don't cry at your desk, right? You go cry in the car, you get yourself figured out, and then you come back in and you engage. We avoid that pain of grief. We avoid our own mortality We don't want to talk about the fact that someday we're going to die. I had friends of ours, and their parents had said, hey, want to let you know, we purchased our tombstones. We purchased our gravesides. Let's go see them together. As if it's a field trip, just like going to the museum. We're going to go check out the grave. Like, it's good. It's wholesome, all those things, but it's awkward. Like, nobody really wants to go stand next to their parents that, oh, that looks nice. We don't want to accept the fact that someday we are all going to die. And we avoid the pain of others. Have you ever noticed the things that we say to someone else who is hurting? It'll be okay. It's going to get better. You'll be fine. It's these words of assurance, words that are wishing for better days to come. These are not words of, let me pull up a chair, have a cup of coffee, and sit with you while you weep. We are a people who enjoy being comfortable. We look for ways to relieve our pain in any way we possibly can. Although, quite frankly, if you said to me, Allison, I seek out pain, I probably would ask you to go start seeing a therapist. None of us actively wants to seek out pain. It is something that we try to avoid. And so we aren't prepared when Jesus says, happy are those who mourn. In our minds, if we have to mourn, we're going to do so with stoic courage, with a stiff upper lip. We're going to protect our image. We're going to help make sure other people aren't uncomfortable, and we're going to get through as quickly as possible. Mourning is not a way to joy for us. And yet Jesus says, blessed or happy are those who mourn. Happy are those who express their grief. And here we see Jesus fully engaging in that, fully expressing his grief. So our question this morning is, how do we work our way through the wilderness to move from the darkness to the light? We learn how to grieve well. It's important to remember there is a distinction between grief and mourning. Grief is the internal process, how we think, how we feel on the inside after we have experienced some sort of loss. Typically, we talk about mourning and grieving in respect to someone having died, but we have losses of all kinds, right? We not only have the loss of the life of someone we've loved, you might have loss over a job, loss of a marriage, loss of life feeling different than what you expected it was going to be. You may have a loss of health. You may be going through a major surgery of some sort. You may have a loss of what was normal and you're now shifting into retirement. You may have a loss of a geographic location by moving. You might have a loss in friendship. Something has shifted, changed, not quite the same. You might have a loss in what your home life looks like. Your kids have gone off to college. Major life changes and disruptions cause all kinds of losses in our life, and some of them feel as big as though someone had died. Our mourning, then, is the outward expression of that grief, and it's essential to healing. And the first thing we have to do in the process is acknowledge that we are experiencing loss. You have to admit that something is going on with your life. Alan Wolfelt calls it saying hello to your grief. We have to admit our reality. I mean, we're a grief-avoidant culture. And the death of someone that you love or having some sort of loss in your life, it opens this door to a new existential reality, a new normal. And no one wants to walk through the door to a new normal. We experience things like shock and numbness and denial, and our survival nature within us says, if I just push it away hard enough and long enough, it'll go away and I don't have to accept that new reality. But slowly and gently and in doses, you have to step through that door. You have to open your heart and your eyes to a new reality. We have to acknowledge that there is something in our life that needs to heal in order for us to begin to heal. Someone we love has died. We have experienced some sort of loss. We have to come to terms with that. We also have to surrender our need to understand. Death and loss are actually beyond our comprehension. They are quite mysterious, and we're not bigger or above any of that. And so we have to shift in our minds what understanding means. Understanding is no longer this idea of logically getting the facts down. Understanding is saying, I'm never quite going to understand this, and I accept that mystery. Now, beyond our internal processes, we begin an external process as well, the process of mourning. And we have to learn to express our grief, even if we're not necessarily comfortable with sharing our emotions and feelings. Mourning is a public way of sharing our truth. It's like saying, attention, something has happened in my life. I loved and I lost and I'm broken. World, say hello to my grief. Grief, say hello to the world. And the most common way that we publicly grieve is we cry. Now, not everyone likes to cry in public. Some of y'all don't even like to cry at all. But it's important to know and to understand that tears are therapeutic. I was reading something earlier this week. They said, one of the reasons that men tend to die before women is not necessarily because they don't go to the doctor, but because they don't cry. Listen up for why. 3 types of tears. The first kind is a reflex, and those are the ones that allow our eyes to clear out those noxious particles that kind of get built up in our eyes. The second kind is continuous. These are the ones that keep our eyes lubricated and also act as an antibacterial to keep our eyes from having some sort of infection. The third kind is emotional. Our reflex tears are 98% water. But our emotional tears also carry, catch this, stress hormones and other toxins that are accumulated during our stress. And when we cry, that releases, that evacuates those stress hormones and toxins from our body. And then after we're done crying, our breathing and our heart rate decrease, and we enter into a calmer biological and emotional state. Our grief, though naturally difficult, is actually a source of energy within us. When we outwardly mourn, what we're doing is unleashing this amazing healing force within us. So essentially, mourning is grief in action. Just like you can't love without action, that becomes unsustainable, it becomes unsatisfying, unfulfilling. You can't mourn without action. You can't grieve without action. We end up shutting ourselves off from life and from love when we don't mourn. But when we find the courage to activate our grief, to outwardly mourn, we create a movement that carries us through and forward. It can be difficult to do the hard work of grief. It can be painful. It can be exhausting. And sometimes we find ourselves resisting that work. It could be too painful or too hard, or we could just be too tired, or maybe just wanting to distract ourselves with something that feels a lot more entertaining. And so we have to acknowledge it and ask ourselves, okay, am I resisting it because I'm actually just too tired and I need a break? And if so, we have to take that break and then get back at it. Or am I resisting this because I don't want to go through the pain? I'd rather go around it. And we have to acknowledge that as well, and perhaps ask for help from a friend or a counselor to help us push through. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Now, the word comforted is easy to associate with being comfortable, like a really soft and cuddly word. I think about those who mourn get to wrap themselves up in a blanket and lay on the couch all day. But the word comforted actually quite literally means strength. It means that when we mourn, someone is coming to us with a transfusion of strength. And when we begin to experience this transformation, we find there's a new normal, a new us on the horizon. Our self-identity begins to change because our connections with others or with the situation changes. But not always in a negative way. A lot of mourners discover that as they transform, as they change, there are actually positive changes in their own lives. But please hear me well when I say do not confuse this with God has caused this loss in my life so that I would learn X, Y, and Z. God does not take your child, your job, your dog, your wife, your health so that you will become a better human. Life happens. We experience pain and brokenness. Then healing brings about transformation, and God walks with us through it all. But there is something that can only be learned by walking through grief, by living through pain and loss. Bob Marley once said, "You don't know how strong you are until being strong is the only option you have." Some days, grief is pajamas and staying in bed all day. Crying until your eyes are red and puffy, screaming at the top of your lungs, collapsing in exhaustion and saying, "I'm not strong enough today." And that's okay. Some days, grief is having coffee with a friend, visiting a gravesite and having conversation, looking at job postings or enjoying good food or a great book or beginning to exercise and saying, "Today I am leaning into the strength that has been given to me." And that's okay. You see, you don't get over, forget, resolve, or recover from loss in life. You heal in time. You carry scars, but are forever changed. And you can't rush grief. It is a long, slow process. We should not rush one another. We should not avoid grief. In fact, we should figure out ways to walk alongside one another and say, "Take your time." But I think if we would lean into the strength that we find in the transformation, we'd find out we're better humans because of it. So our challenge as a community today is say, can we get to a place where we agree that grief, when it's fully and openly explored, expressed, and supported, is a transformative experience? And then can we get to a place where we can say this transformation could actually be harnessed for good? Imagine what would happen if we started helping people in our communities to love and mourn more fully, to really sit with their grief, to really process through their grief. If we helped people to really mourn fully, wouldn't we help them then to love more fully? They wouldn't be so afraid of that process. And if we helped our people and our communities to begin to love more fully, wouldn't we be bettering the fabric of our society? From the outset, it doesn't appear as though mourning leads to much joy. And yet, if we fully and openly express and support and explore our grief and allow ourselves to be transformed, we could in turn transform our world and therein find blessing.